Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the sixth iteration of our webinar series, India in Asia. This series tries to unpack India's changing position as a rising power in Asia. In particular, it asks what kinds of roles can India play as a constructive actor in the region, and how do countries of the region view India and India's rise. In our previous editions, we have discussed India's relations with Maldives, Philippines, Japan, ASEAN, and Malaysia. And today we are here to discuss India's Middle East policy within the context of the current war. And when we prepared the publicity material for this event 3 weeks ago, we kept the language very ambiguous because we didn't know if the war would still be going on or not. And we were actually hoping that the war would be over, so it will be all a little bit in the past tense. But unfortunately, not only is the war going on, it's threatening to actually escalate. Um, and usually in these kind of events, I take some time to set the scene for what is going on. But I think on this particular issue, everybody is well aware of the current situation, at least, and the immediate implications of the war on India. So I don't think I'll have to spend any time setting the scene for this one. But I will flag one thing, which is that India's current position in this whole war comes as a consequence of a long-term policy, which has evolved in the last 10 years quite significantly. And I'm hoping that in this webinar, we can we are able to contextualize the current situation in that long-term story that played out. And if time permits, and if Nicola, you are willing, perhaps we can also talk about the future a little bit and where India can end up in various outcomes of this war. So to unpack this very interesting issue, we have with us Professor Nicola Blarel. He is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Institute of Political Science, Leiden University in the Netherlands. So he's actually joining us at a very early hour in the morning, and thank you for that. He studies global politics and international politics of South Asia. He focuses especially on India's policies in Middle East, and that's why for the last 1 month he has been pretty busy. So thank you that you made some time for us. He wrote a very important book on India-Israel relations, which is called The Evolution of India's Israel Policy, Continuity, Change, and Compromise since 1922. And he also co-edited Oxford Handbook of India's National Security. He received his PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington, and before that studied at Sciences Po Paris and Strasbourg. And he has worked with the French Foreign Ministry and several think tanks in India, including ORF, Carnegie, and IDSA, CSH. So it is my pleasure to welcome him. Welcome, Nicola, and please, over to you.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you for first for inviting me. And ISAS, obviously, it's always happy to be back at ISAS virtually. I've been there in the room, the actual room, to present a few years ago, and to also invite me to present on this a little bit challenging topic. As you said, it's ongoing, very fluid situation, but I'll do my best and to provide a little bit of a historical context. So thanks for everybody for joining and really open and willing to discuss the implications during the Q&A, because a lot of things are still moving parts, and obviously maybe I won't be able to discuss all the multi-dimensional kind of developments, but I map, and also all the historical context. But I'm happy in the Q&A going further in some of the things. As Sandeep kindly noted in the introduction, I've written a longer historical narrative of India's Israel policy. So I'm happy to also provide a little bit of context. But I'll focus, as Sandeep mentioned, in the last 10 years, because, well, we'll think the world and India have been a bit caught by surprise with the latest development. I would argue that actually there's a couple of indicators that have shown that India would be placed in a difficult kind of situation. It's been very good at balancing multiple relationships in the Middle East, and especially in the last 10 years. I would date it actually to 11 years ago when Prime Minister Modi traveled to Abu Dhabi, first visit to the Middle East. He had traveled to Turkey, but that was part of a multilateral meeting. And I think in the context of the outreach to the Middle East, it was very interesting that he went to Abu Dhabi and not Tel Aviv first. And I think this was part of a larger realignment of India's policy towards the Gulf, and also got facilitated and improved also relations with Israel and also with Iran for a little while. But the things had been going, things had been becoming a little bit more difficult first under the first Trump administration, and especially over the last year and a half, with since Trump came back to power, with the I would say a sharp geopolitical polarization. There's also the context, obviously, October 7 and the multiple wars and fronts that Israel engaged in, but also the situation since June 2025 and the 12 Days War. The situation for India had become very complicated, especially with this maximum pressure from both Israel and the US increasing on Iran and limiting also the options that India has, and also the spillover the war to Doha in last August with the bombing, the Israeli bombing, and then bringing indirectly Pakistan back into the security architecture of the Gulf, where India had made, I think, headways and developed really good ties with the GCCs, so the Gulf Cooperation Council states, at the detriment of Pakistan for the past decade. So I'll try to bring all that a bit of context about all this, but really the core question I think on my presentation is. What is this recent crisis, and especially the last decade, and then what happened over the last 2 years meant for India and its relationships across the region? As I said, it had a long-standing strategy of engaging all sides, but is that actually being tested by the recent conflict and the regional polarization over the last 2 years? And can it sustain its balancing strategy? And maybe can it play also a bigger role, as Sandeep mentioned, of mediating? My first tentative answers is don't really count on it, unfortunately, but I'll argue that there may be capacities or a potential for India to play a role. So I'll start first with why the Middle East matters to India and why India is severely affected. For those of you, this might be some people connecting from New Delhi or from India. You directly affect every household in India is directly affected right now. And it's a global phenomenon, but South Asian countries, especially India to some degree, a little bit less than maybe the other South Asian countries, but also affected directly by gas prices and a multitude of different prices. If you think that it's only about filling gas into your car, there's also issues about agriculture, etc., heating, and everything that is directly connected to energy and energy resources. And India is very dependent on importing resources, and especially from the Middle East. So India is severely dependent on the Middle East. So energy security, about 50% of its crude oil imports come from the Gulf, and especially from Iraq, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Most of them of these resources were being transported directly through the Strait of Hormuz, which is relatively closed. We're hearing that India has been able to negotiate some degree of passage for some of its ships that are with Indian flags or with that are going to India. This is still very uncertain, and that's not how the insurances companies are looking at it, right? So there's still very much fluid, very instability when it comes to getting these imports. And this is not just crude oil, there's also natural gas imports. And India is, like many countries, very dependent on Qatar for this, right? Not so much on Iran, and India had been importing a bit from Iran, but had been decreasing for the past decade. So it's mostly 50% of its natural gas imports were coming from the GCC. So, and most of that, as I said, transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. So India is directly affected and will be probably affected for the coming months, if not years, by this crisis at the energy level. There's also the element of trade. We think mostly about energy, but India is also a strong trade relations with the GCCs, notably UAE, which is its third commercial partner, and Saudi Arabia's fifth commercial partner. So we always forget about this, that these two countries are very important commercial partners and hubs for the Indian economy. There's also important sovereign funds based in the Gulf states that are investing heavily. Now, they promised major investments in the infrastructure that's still cumulatively starting only to grow, but it's still very much huge investments. I mean, we're talking about 100 billion promises from the Saudi side, and from 75 billion from the UAE. So this is important, and mostly a lot of in the infrastructure, notably port infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and a lot of logistical investments in India. So again, this is also important for India, and so trade investments is also taking a hit because of the crisis. And then maybe last but not least, and I think most important, this is actually what the Indian government has been mentioning first as one of the major issues dictating to some degree its policy towards the Gulf and the Middle East. It's the close to 10 million Indians based in the Gulf states. This is long-term diaspora base, mostly, again, we would argue mostly working in labor, low labor, low waged labor, manual labor in infrastructure, housing, restaurants, hotels, etc. But it's actually much more diverse. There's a lot of actually Indian billionaires, Indians working in the tech industry that was starting to develop in Dubai. So it's also hitting a lot of these different diaspora constituencies and which are basically affected by the directly the reprisals from Iran following the U.S.-Iran strikes on U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran. So this is another element. About 150 to 200,000 Indians were evacuated back to India. But again, most of the so that still leaves more than 9 million Indians that are left, that are staying because there are the economic opportunities, the remittances that are very important for them to send back to their families, to certain kind of state economies, at the macro level, India's economy are very important. So that's also taking a toll. So India is affected at multi levels. And that, I mean, as Sandeep mentioned, most of you are following the news. So I think the Indian media has covered widely these different levels that are affected. There's another thing that has been, I think, directly shaping India's policy towards the Middle East, and is a bit discussed a bit less. India is closely monitoring also China's growing investments in the Middle Eastern infrastructure, notably in the Gulf states, a little bit in Israel, but mostly in the Gulf states, right? This is because there's a strict competition, as we all know, between India and China. But it's mostly visible in Southeast Asia, as you might directly know, but this is actually maybe less discussed in the context of the Middle East. But there is also some competition. You see, China's been investing now for the past decade, around the same time when India made that outreach to the Gulf states in 2015, has been investing very strongly in the infrastructure of some of the Gulf states, notably in ports, but also railway connectivity, obviously energy infrastructure, etc. Because it's central also for same reason, energy security for China. And this is not completely lost on India, that has also been looking at this and trying to invest and work some alternative arrangements with the Gulf states. This is central for India's economic and strategic interest. It looks also at security implications. You know, there's dual ports with dual utility for China, etc. So there's obviously this is closely monitored, and it's also a concern for some of the Gulf states about becoming too strategically dependent also on China, hedging to some degree, and welcoming Indian, maybe not investments. We're not seeing the financial investments from China, but at the same scale. But India also offering, being Indian companies coming in to work in basically competing on some tenders for some connectivity infrastructure development, notably in port. Adani is very much present, but also in railway connectivity, metro, etc. So again, in India is present to some degree, and it's welcomed to some degree by the GCCs who are developing their own strategic hedging policies. So this is the kind of structural background of why India has been looking historically and more at the Middle East, and especially at the Gulf states. And it's explained why India over the last decade, since that very important visit to Abu Dhabi in August 2015, sorry, India has been pursuing what some in Delhi would call a multi-alignment or kind of strategic autonomy policy toward the Middle East. But I would argue it's actually a continuation of older policies, right? I think since the early 1990s, when India established diplomatic relations with Israel, resumed diplomatic ties also to some degree with Iran, that had become a little bit difficult since the revolution 1979 and the Iran-Iraq war, and also started developing closer political ties. It always had energy and economic ties with the Gulf states, but started developing closer political ties with the Gulf states. So there had been already a building up, especially also on Manmohan Singh, of closer outreach, and this is in par and sync with India's growing economic capacities, outlook. Some of these countries wanted also to engage more with India, right? as one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. So again, the new twist, I think, since 2015 and that visit is a stronger political kind of visibility, strategic kind of coherence, I think, under the various Modi governments, basically playing on this important economic people-to-people relationship that existed for the diaspora, and also benefiting to some degree with maybe some degree of regional stability that happened maybe in the 2010s, at least pre 20 following the Arab Spring, but also pre some of the crisis that would happen in the early 2020s. So it was possible for India to engage with many actors, whether Modi actually visited most Middle Eastern states before he went to Tel Aviv. So it's possible to engage with most actors without being completely locked into the rivalries. And this is a structural opportunity for India that probably didn't exist in the past, and that has been deeply followed up on, acted upon by the Modi government from 2015 onwards. And with Israel, I would argue defense cooperation was already strong. We keep forgetting this, but under the Indian Congress and the UPA governments, India developed very strong defense strategic relationship with Israel. It was just less visible, right? So even when Modi comes to power, and even when he visits Tel Aviv for the first time, an Indian prime minister goes to Tel Aviv in July 2017. Most of the defense deals that are announced are mainly defense deals that had already begun to be negotiated by the UPA governments, right? So it's a deepening of the defense cooperation, but it's not substantially. I think the defense collaboration starts being a little bit more elevated after the re-election of Narendra Modi in 2019. But Israel, as we all know, and you've read probably a lot of articles around the time of Modi's visit to Tel Aviv, late February, is that it's important in air defense, supplier in air defense system, drone surveillance technology, electronic warfare capacities. So this kind of technical edge that Israel has been able to provide India, notably in the kind of automated warfare under the escalatory potential of crisis between two nuclear states. It's been able to provide a lot of technology to try to keep an edge, notably in the May 2025 88 hours war, where a lot of, as you know, you've probably heard, a lot of Israeli drones and technology was used in the context of the conflict. So Israel was an important strategic defense partner, a little bit on economy, a little bit of an agriculture, but not so much. Really on the economic side, as I said, the Gulf states, especially UAE and Saudi Arabia, I mentioned already some of the figures, the major energy suppliers for India, along with Iraq on crude oil. This is where also the major Indian diaspora is present in these two countries and a few of the other GCCs. Major part of the total remittances that are being sent, and increasing. If you think at the macro scale, it's still important for India's GDP, about 2-3%. But if you look at the disaggregate at the state level, for Kerala, it's about a third of its budget is dependent on on remittances coming back mostly from the Gulf, right? So again, very important partner for diaspora and remittances, and it's important to maintain the welfare and support of that diaspora. And I mentioned two of the India's most important key commercial partners are also based in that region, and I mentioned also increasing investments from the sovereign funds. That being said, I would say until maybe early 2020s, Iran still was an important partner. It's historically been an energy partner. I would argue since 2019, that's been less the case. Maximum pressure from the US. India had already started decreasing. Already under the Obama sanctions, it had started reducing its energy imports from Iran, and that increased under Trump 1.0, right? To the point that Iran was no longer one of the major energy partners, and that is historically a big change. Iran was always, since the 1970s, one of the biggest energy importers for India, but that already was no longer so much of a factor. But I would argue Modi went to Tehran before he went to Tel Aviv. That's an important also data point. And he also has maintained, this government has maintained a strong relation with Iran because of the importance of the strategic Chabahar port, right? We all know about Chabahar. It's an important port to kind of counterbalance Gwadar and Chinese investment in Gwadar. It's an important also port for energy export to some degree, even though if you look at the numbers, there have never been that strong energy exports coming out of Chabahar directly going to India. But it's the potential to keep this link with Afghanistan, with Central Asia, the North-South corridor, an alternate corridor access to Russia, and then to potentially for the Caucasian to also to Russia and Europe has always been part of India's strategic calculus. And India has been very successful at maintaining a waiver in the sanctions towards Iran for Chabahar until April. So the waiver expansion was supposed to stop in April. So that's why you see already in the last 5-6 months reduced investments in Chabahar, right? So this is important to note in the context of everybody's India tilted towards Israel and US in the context of this crisis. India has downgraded its relation with Iran. The relations were already decreasing, but India made an effort to maintain these ties. And I would say just a quick word about the multi-alignment in Palestine, right? Despite the more visible relationship between India and Israel, Modi going to Tel Aviv, being the first Indian prime minister, the elevation of strategic partnerships, etc., I think there's still been some degree of public announcements or public re-announcement or kind of reminding regularly that there's a continued political support for Palestine, for the two-state solution, for Palestine statehood, 1967 UN Security Council resolution borders, maintaining the diplomatic ties with Palestinian leadership. The Palestinian foreign minister was in Delhi in January, along with the other Arab foreign ministers, or Arab League foreign ministers. There's an Arab League India summit. So again, India has always made sure that it was also a consistent, it's not huge donations, but it's consistent support to UNRWA to support Palestinian refugees. So again, this has always been present and regularly publicly reminded, right? So the reason I point out is that India for the last decade has been able to maximize, I think, economic strategic benefits from all these relationships. And Modi has been able to travel to most of the capitals while avoiding regional rivalries. And I would argue this has actually been, it was, I mean, you could argue there's some adroitness or some diplomatic exploitation also of our opportunities that were seen and acted upon by the Indian government and Indian diplomacy. But there's some structural developments that facilitate this. Is mainly the US role, I would think, of the last decade, right? India has actually benefited. It doesn't say so. It doesn't say that aligned its interest with the US, but it really benefited from US security policies towards the region, right? The US security presence, the fact that it provides some degree. Now, you would argue in the last 6 months, you would argue maybe it doesn't provide regional stability. It's actually a disruptor. But to some degree, by the protection of shipping lanes over the last decade, by maintaining some kind of strict reassurance to a couple of the Gulf states and other regional partners, whether it's vis-a-vis Iran or other actors, there was some, and China and India benefited greatly from actually not having to commit too much to their security provision or security to basically have to up their security presence to support their investments and their energy exports coming from the Gulf states. Mainly, that was provided to some degree indirectly by the US. And furthermore, at the end of the Trump 1.0 administration, the efforts to normalize ties between Israel and a couple of the Arab states, notably then the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain, really benefited all India's multi-alignment or balancing strategy, right? It doesn't mean that India now can only develop in parallel good relations with the UAE and Israel. It could actually create these trilateral cooperations, these synergies that they felt were visible between the UAE and Israel and India. And that's how you saw the emergence of these multilaterals, that were kind of vouched, supported by the US, right? So the I2U2, the India, Israel, US, UAE, and then that progressively evolving towards connectivity projects, and then the announcement of the IMEC, the India Middle East corridor, in the margins of the G20 summit in September 2023. And this is facilitated by Trump administration by the end, and then by the Biden administration. This was a big project for Biden, and especially National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. If you read his foreign affairs piece, which came out, unfortunately for him, at alongside the October 7 crisis, that the U.S. was actually basically pivoting finally maybe more to the Indo-Pacific and didn't need to have such a strong security presence because there was all these unilateral partnerships supported by the U.S. that would create other regional stakeholders to basically share the strategic security burden, right? And India was a major, I think, had to play a major role in these policies towards the Middle East. So these initiatives, it really allowed India to deepen connectivity, to expand, I think, its economic partnerships more visibly with different actors, and to develop these trilateral partnerships at some points, and to counter also Chinese influence in infrastructure and trade networks. So the I2U2, the IMEC, New Delhi will never say these are then to counter the Belt and Road Initiative's infrastructure developments in the Middle East, but to some degree that's kind of was an alternative offered to the strategic edging policies that I mentioned of the Gulf states and Israel. Because it's not just the Gulf states, Israel has also had a lot of major Chinese investments in its ports, in its railway connectivity, and it was also growing wary about Chinese investments, and also it was under U.S. pressure to decouple or to limit, to de-risk a little bit some of its partnerships with China. So again, so the U.S. presence, the U.S. role in the Middle East was actually very supportive of India's policies and facilitated India's multi-alignment. That is until Trump came back. I think since Trump came back, there was already kind of the hints of the maximum pressure on Iran, which were India had been able to negotiate itself out through the waiver on the Chabahar port, but that's no longer really possible in the new strategic environment and the new, we probably have the other talks in the seminars are probably the Indian government misread Trump 2.0. I think on the Middle East, you can see definitely this. India was not able to cut out the same bargains. It was not able to develop the still same trilateral partnerships. There was a discussion when Modi went in February 2025 to see Trump about IMEC. The Modi mentioned the golden route or whatever it was the kind of wording that he used. He didn't use IMEC. He didn't put India as the strong center of this new hub, this new corridor. He was mostly looking at what would be the U.S. interest, and he mentioned Italy as being also an important actor in that corridor. So this was a different kind of administration which was looking at the Middle East in a different way, less favorable maybe to align directly with India's interest, more direct pressures, direct expectations to align with U.S. policies toward the Middle East, to align with pressure on Iran, to align with other pressures on other actors. So this meant maybe less convergence and pushing India to take sides, which India doesn't like in its traditional multi-alignment, strategic autonomy engagement with the Middle East. And that's forced already India's to severe ties to some degree with Iran, which it did not want to. And that's in the context already of this maximum pressure, which is on Iran mainly, but also pressuring a little bit India to take sides, that the Modi visit, I think, on February 25 happens to Tel Aviv. This visit, I'll confess, as someone that closely follows India-Israel relations, I don't understand it. I don't understand the significance or the added value of that visit for India and for the Modi government. It's most of the deals that were announced as big deliverables were already negotiated. The MOU on defense cooperation had been signed months earlier in 2025. There's a labor mobility agreement that was signed, but again, there was one that was signed in summer 2023. You didn't need Indian Prime Minister to travel to Israel to sign it, right? So again, they were no major achievements. It was mostly a symbolical visit. Again, the last visit happened 9 years earlier in July 2027. So it had taken 9 years for Modi to go back to Tel Aviv. You probably could wait a few more months, or if you wanted to kind of make a symbolic recognition of Israel's strategic support, because that's, I think, what was driving a little bit is the support that Israel has provided at the defense strategic level, and especially during the May 2025 crisis. At that point, the only country that unconditionally supported India during the entire escalation of the crisis in May 2025 was Israel. Armenia was the other one, but Israel was maybe more the significant strategic support. So I think to some degree, there had been attempts by Netanyahu to visit Delhi a few times since October 7. So I think because of the relative isolation of Israel, mainly in the global south, this visit was an important diplomatic achievement for Israel, and I think that was part of the driver towards it. At the strategic level, I still don't understand why India did it at that time, especially as you had mounting pressure on Iran, you had mobilization of U.S. forces. So what happened 2 days earlier cannot have taken completely the Modi government by surprise. This was imminent. And then there was probably a consideration of the diplomatic cost of that visit. So there's also the debate. Was Modi actually briefed when he was there by the Israeli government? My argument is probably he wasn't. There was probably some very broad discussions about escalation, but there was also that negotiation happening with brokered by Oman in Geneva. So it wasn't clear. Probably the Israelis were very vague. But in the end, the outcome is the same. Either you were told and you didn't do anything to try to prevent try to create contingency plans because of as I said, the interest of India that were directly affected, diaspora, energy, trade, etc. Or you weren't briefed, and then what's the value of this sort of partnership if you don't have the trust to discuss these issues, right? So this creates unease, and the problem with the visit is, obviously Modi couldn't prevent the crisis. Most governments, even if they were in the know, probably couldn't prevent what would happen. But because of the visit, Modi and his government are directly connected to some degree by the escalation and the crisis, right? Because it just shows the political significance that India had put in this relationship with Israel, and it also puts in peril to some degree the careful, calibrated multi-alignment, especially as Israel is increasingly since June 2025 and the war with Iran in August 2025, the bombing in Doha, seeing it as an important disruption force, and indirectly, the U.S. not seeing as not able to restrain Israel in this conflict, right? So this is also something that is being visible for the GCC, that are having doubts about U.S. and Israel being playing a more stable U.S. security role, and then India probably didn't see this happening. And this comes to my last point, that there's a concurrent dynamic which has probably hurt India's stature and leverage in the Middle East. India has been able to talk to everybody, has been able to present itself as a very important economic and strategic partner for a lot of the Gulf states in Israel, because also Pakistan has become less of a factor for the GCC. The problem after the Doha strike, the problem with India not stepping up maybe into playing a bigger security role in the region, because relying and depending a little bit too much on the U.S. Security architecture, and then depending and then not being able to prevent or do anything about what would happen because of U.S.-Israel actions since June 2025, is that India is not seen as a reliable security partner to some degree. It's an important economic partner. It will stay as an important economic partner and an important place to invest in, but it doesn't play that role of external security provider, and it's not balancing or an alternative when you have the U.S. playing this disruption role, right? So what happens is Pakistan was able to come back. Pakistan is strictly historically being a major security partner for the GCC, and especially UAE. If you don't know this data point, another one is that in Pakistan had 15 to 20,000 troops at one point in Saudi Arabia protecting the borders, right? So this is important. It had that de-escalated. Pakistan was no longer a security factor because under the Imran Khan government, there was a parliamentary vote that refused Pakistan's role in the Yemen war. So since then, there had been a downgrade of relations. They had been very difficult, and this linked also to Pakistani unstable politics. But that's when the concurrence with the looking towards India from the kind of look East, look India policy from the UAE and Saudi Arabia started, right? Now, Pakistan, and I would say we were talking about diplomatic skills. I think Munir and to some degree Sharif have been able to play a little bit better to play on these unease and the concerns of, I think, some of the GCCs about this situation since June 2025. And also, I've been a little bit better, as when we saw in the resolution of the May 2025 crisis. I've been better also at playing the Trump second administration's kind of more transactional logic, and Pakistan has been able to be more flexible in offering solutions and off ramps to the U.S. in certain crises in the region. It's strengthened, as we said, the security cooperative Saudi Arabia. The announcement in August 2025 that major security agreement that we don't know completely what is inside or what it entails, and Iran kind of called a bluff to some degree over the last months, because Pakistan has not come to directly support Saudi Arabia as it got attacked. Now, you could argue Saudi Arabia has not declared a war, has not responded to the attacks from Iran yet. So Pakistan can play on that ambiguity, but obviously there's question about what the security agreement actually entails. But it's there. It was very visible when it was signed in August. And also you have to know that Pakistan supported Trump's Gaza plan. It offered to send peacekeeping troops in Gaza. It joined the Board of Peace. And now we have seen this very surprising development of the effort to mediate with Iran, when Iran is still not sure if it wants to participate, but Pakistan hosted, Turkey, Egypt, and I forget the third country from the Middle East that they hosted recently in Pakistan to try to find a solution or to the crisis or way to de-escalate. So Pakistan has really proved to be a more responsive partners to the concerns of the Gulf states and to some degree the US, and that creates alternate strategic competition that India probably didn't have over the last decade when it was doing this multi-alignment strategy. Now, right now it's Pakistan. What if China also comes back? And China brokered a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran a couple of years ago. So China can always come back. So India has been a little bit complacent with the flexible position it was in because of some concurrent strategic developments in a structural level, and has probably not developed kind of a plan to deal with if the region was again to be polarized, if the US was to play a more disruptive role or to de-escalate its engagement in the region. And clearly didn't think about China coming back as being a streak. The recent statements from Dr. Jaishankar proved that, it's not about name calling that will provide another position for India to play a mediating role. It's now to offer kind of an alternative to what the Pakistani mediating offerings right now. So this creates questions about India's strategic autonomy. I would say that India has preserved it, and that can still play that when it talks to a lot of the actors in the Middle East. It's resisted to be falling into formal alliances, whether it's with Israel and the US. It's refused to take regional rivalries. It's trying to correct the course with Iran, trying to create, again, a dialogue with Iran, which has benefited having access to Hormuz to some degree. It's refused to publicly endorse maximalist pressure from Israel and US towards Iran. So there's some kind of, you could argue it's this purely just rhetoric. Implicitly, is India supporting to some degree the escalation that happened over the last month? That can be discussed, but it's refused to at least engage in direct support of the operation, and it's maintained again. It's really if you look at the rhetoric about India, it's been very supportive of the GCC security concerns, right? If the first call by Modi after the February 28th and the escalation of the crisis has been to the UAE and condemning the attacks on the GCC. So there's some degree of trying to preserve these links with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. But it's clear that India's Middle East policy right now is facing its most serious test, I think, in decades. You could argue, and I can talk that in Q&A, I think there's two crucial junctures when India's Middle East policy was a bit more in dire straits. If you pardon the pun, it's I think the crisis maybe I think in the 67, I can talk about this, 67 when India was caught in a little bit between Israel and Egypt and didn't see really the polarization that was happening in the Middle East and was signing maybe too closely with Egypt, which created many other problems with other regional actors in the Middle East, and that benefited Pakistan at the time. And the other one is the early 90s. You might remember Foreign Minister, External Affairs Minister Gujral going to hug Saddam Hussein at a couple of weeks before the beginning of the Gulf crisis and the Iraq War. So again, that put again India in a very complicated position vis-a-vis a lot of regional actors and vis-a-vis the US at the time. So again, India has been there and has been able to repair, and actually post 1992, after that infamous hug with Saddam Hussein, was able to actually develop, I think, its most effective multi-alignment policy with the Middle East. So it's not that India can't repair some of the damages of the last month at the diplomatic reputation level, but I think it's facing more competitive diplomacy when we look at Pakistan, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and potentially Chinese playing bigger role in that region than I think a couple 3 decades ago when it was facing these other dilemmas. So the question is, can India engage still with all sides simultaneously, or will it be pushed to stake sides? That is the big question of the next, I think, few weeks. And there's the other question that my point is, India still have a principled position to the Middle East? I know that's another debate right now in New Delhi, which I'm happy also discussing in the Q&A. I kept it to an analytical standpoint for now, but we can also talk about the principled and morals of India's position when it comes to keeping that equidistance with all the regional actors. Thank you. I think I've talked for way too long, so I'm happy now to engage with the Q&A.
No, that was fantastic. That was a very good overview of the situation, as well as pretty interesting insights and literally how all various so many pieces that are working in that region, how they all fit together from an Indian vantage point, which is a very difficult task. Um, I'll invite the audience to write their questions in the Q&A box or just message me, whichever works for you. In the meantime, I have a bunch of questions. I'll
Sure.
get started with a few. But let me start with the first one, which is the most basic one. What's India's position? The whole war is about, at some point, about Iran's nuclear program, right? At least like on paper. What's India's position on Iran's nuclear program?
So the Iran nuclear program, actually, I traced the beginning of the downgrading of India's relation with the kind of pressure that was put starting with the Obama administration on sanctions, and which actually India complied to some degree. And then that escalated even more, I think, under the Trump administration, and then Biden actually, which didn't go back on some of the sanctions, and India complied. So, but actually, I think at the beginning of the more difficult relationships, difficult discussions between India and Iran, and you have to know, to give a little bit of our background, since the early 90s, everybody talks about Narasimha as a prime minister establishing diplomatic relations with Israel, and that was the major change with vis-a-vis the Middle East, West Asia. But actually, Raoul traveled to Tehran. So it's also, at the time, India had a very difficult relationship with the Iranian regime. And it started, I think, this outreach was very profitable for India for energy reasons. But also, Iran was an important diplomatic support at the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, because Iran was the actor in the 90s when there was a counterinsurgency in Kashmir, which was vetoing most of the condemning resolutions, mostly sponsored by Pakistan and a few other Middle Eastern states against India. So Iran was a very strong diplomatic support. So you have to know, there's the energy and there's this strong diplomatic relationship that starts emerging back then, which leads to some of the agreements that were signed in the early 2000s, the Delhi and Tehran declaration. So Iran becomes one of the first strategic partners when India starts using that label in the early 2000s. That being said, by 2005, as India is trying to develop better ties with with the US, sorry, and trying to develop negotiate a nuclear agreement, it votes at the IAEA against Iran, right? So this is, I think, the beginning of a position that changes. India basically did not have, to my knowledge, did not have any strong positions on Iran and its nuclear program, and it starts developing that around 2005 and then onwards. Mostly a discussion. It uses this term that nuclear proliferation obviously is problematic, and it having a non-nuclear weapon states in the close regions could create some kind of instability. So it uses kind of that language to justify to some degree its vote, and it becomes a consistent supporter of negotiations with Iran. Right? It supports a lot of the negotiation that the Europeans and to some degree the U.S. are having with Iran. It's a big supporter of the process that leads to the JCPOA. That was widely welcomed by Prime Minister Modi when it was signed. So India has always been towards negotiation, a solution. So it has its concerns with Iran developing its nuclear weapons program, given that it could create escalation or tensions in the region because with Pakistan and other actors, whether it is in the Middle East or South Asia, Central Asia. So India has always looked at that framing about nuclear stability created by nuclear proliferation. But it also has supported that Iran is obviously maybe entitled to some degree to have a nuclear civil and nuclear program, and or it had to negotiate with the international community to find kind of some way to satisfy its own energy or security concerns when it came to the broader Middle East or region. So again, that way, India was a big supporter of the international negotiations that were happening with the Iranian regime, and never aligned with the maximalist rhetoric that some of the U.S. administration used, or never aligned with Israel, which was a close partner of India, even under the Modi government, never aligned with the Israeli rhetoric on Iran.
Right. Um, so the other question I have is about India's tilt India's tilt in this war towards U.S. Israel. Um, it seems like there have been a few steps where perhaps whatever calculation went into the initial discussion, they could have been revisited, right? Like, so you point out from the beginning the point that the visit, either Prime Minister Modi was not informed or was informed, whatever, but there was clearly some kind of failure in that strategic partnership or some kind of something lacking in the strategic partnership. That can lead you to say that, okay, you put me in an awkward position, I don't have to tilt you that way. Then there is a sinking of the Iranian warship, of coming back from Indian multilateral exercise, and again, politically, both on international level and domestically, some kind of a blowback is happening. I was in Thailand at the time when that happened, and in even Thais noticed that India didn't say anything after that, right? Like they immediately pointed that out. So that, and then I think that now when Iran has clearly demonstrated that it is resilient and able to survive the attack, so whatever the initial expectation was, is clearly not panning out. Do you think any of these data points are, I mean, clearly they're not right now, as of now, pushing India to reconsider its. Why are they not pushing India to reconsider whatever the initial calculation was? What is the initial calculation then?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, and I'm still trying to figure that one out. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out why India was felt confident at one point to tilt, right? It's been very careful, and they're careful to the point that mostly careful in its rhetoric and some of his visits, diplomacy toward the Middle East. But if you look at some substantial agreements, notably in defense, the relationship with Israel has been developing quite substantially. So if you look at the figures with Iran, this situation had been getting worse. So despite the rhetoric, people were already seeing that there was a tilt to some degree. But I don't see why you need to have the public visit, right? That's another elevation, and where India has been, this government has been really risk averse. That was kind of surprising to me, because then whatever happened, and there could be a debate that they could have anticipated a little bit. This government or the MEA or and the security establishment could have anticipated what would happen, right? So there was maybe a risk, and that was acceptable to some degree to be seen. So it was that because you could argue there's never a good timing to go to Israel since October 7 in any case, and that they kept pushing back. The other is that maybe a visit after the crisis would have been worse, symbolically, etc. Again, I think that relationship was good enough without the visit. So I still don't understand the timing. Now the timing and the crisis has escalated. So how do you go back from that? I think there's what I saw and what I found very interesting is the criticism are coming from both sides, right? This is not, usually the Congress has been always critical of the perceived tilts in October 7 towards Israel, and with less of public declaration of support to Palestinians or statements about Gaza, etc. But now we're seeing actually within the street community, most of the former military or analysts that were close to the BJP have been very critical of the retrospectively of the visit. They're very supportive of the visit, and suddenly a couple of days later, very critical of the timing of the visit, and then about the silence and the basically non-reaction to what happened close to the Indian coast on March 5th, right? So this is actually new. I think this is bound to lead to another debate. I think there was little debate about India's Middle East policy because everybody seemed to be aligning mostly with the multi-alignment, and I think that was facilitated again by structural developments, partly by Indian diplomacy, but also a lot of structural developments. And I think now that it's being tested, you're seeing a new debate about maybe we should. I mean, obviously it makes sense to have a strict partnership with Israel. There's a lot of things that India is getting from Israel when it comes to weapons and technology. And again, I could talk also about agriculture and some other types of technology cooperation, but maybe we don't need to elevate that at the public level when you see that it creates unease, and not just in Iran and Tehran, right? It creates unease in other Western actors. I mentioned the GCCs were all troubled by what happened in Doha in August, right? So this kind of Israel playing this disruptive role, its war spillovering to other parts of the region. So clearly that is creating some unease, and that will force India to do course correction. It will have to do course correction when its relation with the GCCs. I think India-UAE relations is a very strong relationship, so that one will stick. I think it's more with other GCC states, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Kuwait, that India will have to do some efforts to kind of explain its position. It will also have to do some efforts with the global south. I think India is already since October 7, India's position, and you mentioned Thailand, India's position on Israel-Palestine has become very confusing, right? Because there's these strong statements in the initial days after October 7 of very strong support to Israel's reprisals against terrorist attacks, which this government links to some degree with creates these analogous positioning with some of the attacks from Pakistan towards India with proxies, etc. So that created a lot of unease in the global south. They didn't really understand India's position. Sometimes it supports Palestine. It doesn't support some of the UN General Assembly votes, but a lot of times it abstains or supports U.S. and Israel positions. So where is India's position? Where is India's historical position? Because India had this reputation from these decades at the UN and other multilateral fora of strong support for Palestine. And again, even from 92 to I think early 2010s, India had developed really good relations with Israel, with maintaining that kind of strong symbolical public position of support to Palestine. So there's a lot of unease about following October 7, 2023, and India's positioning. India and that kind of criticism didn't exist, I think, prior to October 7. It wasn't noticed as much that India has changed its voting patterns, etc. So I think this is pushing India into a position where it's multi-balancing, or you don't have France, but there's a slight tilt that's going on a little bit discreetly, is actually more visible, and could create tensions to some degree with some of the partners in the Gulf and broader Middle East, and with the global South countries, which obviously are very critical about Gaza and then critical about the escalation of the crisis. You could argue that there are tensions. You could argue that Iran's policies were but again, this particular crisis was initiated by Israel and the US, and the GCCs and a lot of global South countries are seeing it that way. So if India is seen as being tilting towards that position and having implicitly supported or facilitated that crisis, that will not be also positive for India's future relation with that region and then the broader global South, especially when China is trying to take an alternate position. Since October 7 has taken a very pro-Palestine position, despite its strong economic partnerships with Israel. So then that competition with China and the global South with the GCCs will come back to hurt India if India is seen as tilting.
But just to clarify, because I was under the impression that now or at least the American media is saying that the Saudis and Gulf countries are now pushing Americans to stay in the war. And so GCC, I mean, does India have to explain to GCC in terms of GCC?
Yeah.
What is their position on the Iran war, and how is that in variance with what India's position is?
This is actually complicated. I mean, there's been some reports about the Saudi kind of double game a little bit on this. The Saudis in public want de-escalation, but then it seems like in MBS in his private discussion with the Trump administration, is actually asking to double down. So we don't know exactly what's going on here. But from my understanding, is the other GCCs are asking them, obviously in the short term they will always need some type of U.S. support, right? It's the fact that they're U.S. bases, the fact that they're U.S. technology interceptors, etc., as defended to some degree the GCC spaces. But then it's also created them to be directly targeted, right? It's also it creates them, it puts them in this precarious position. The reason Iran has targeted them because they are U.S. bases, and because these were seen to be closely aligning with U.S. security interests. So I think there's going to be some rethinking in the coming, not in the short term, but maybe more in the medium term, about the relationship with the U.S., especially if the U.S. is creating these disruptions and creating this escalation potential with Iran, so creating conditions for long-term war and instability in the region. GCCs have benefited grandly from stability in that part of the Middle East, which was unseen for, I think, decades. The entire myth and reputation of Dubai as the hub for many investments for influencers moving there, etc., it was stability, right? So this is being directly affected, and to some degree can be linked to tensions created by the U.S. and Israel, right? And at least the escalation. So I think that will push them to rethink and to look for alternatives. So this is back to that more maybe strategic edging policy from the Gulf states. And what can they see as alternatives? They were hoping India would step up and play a bigger role. Mostly it has happened, and I think in economic and alternative for infrastructure and partnerships, connective partnerships, IMEC and other projects. But it hasn't happened at the security level, right? So now, was it the mismanaged expectations about India playing a big role? I don't think India will play a big role. India will be very much present when it comes to maritime security and non-traditional security threats. It's shown during the Houthi crisis and previous piracy crisis that it could play a big role. But obviously, India cannot play a role that the US has. So US will always be present to some degree. But I think the GCC will look for alternatives to pressure or at least play against US if US plays this role of disruptor and force in the region, or doesn't rein in Israel when you look at what happened in Doha in August, right? So I think that's what they're looking for, and that's where India a little bit lost the plot, and that's why Pakistan came back in. I think no one expected the August announcement for that partnership between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And I think India was even surprised by it. So there was that statement that the MEA doesn't comment immediately on certain developments. It commented on this one. So again, I think this is where India needs to rethink that the GCCs might be expecting a little bit more for India, I think, and maybe the tilt towards Israel is misperceived because Israel has clearly has been at the initiation of a lot of instability for the past 2 years. And India tilting with Israel is seen as something that is negative. Maybe also there's a possibility that India, being the biggest defense partner for Israel, biggest market for defense export, gives India some degree of leverage to also have a discussion or to rein in Israel. We talked about mediating. India has a good relation with all actors and could maybe have more leverage on Israel than Delhi thinks. Yeah.
I have a question here from Ivan Lidarev, who is my colleague. I'll just read it out. Thank you, Nicola, for a very comprehensive presentation. I have two questions. One, to what an extent do the divisions of the Middle East, UAE versus Saudi and Turkey versus Israel, influence South Asia's geopolitical dynamics, especially India-Pakistan relations? Some of it you have already covered. How does this shape Delhi's policy towards the region? And the second is, how has the recently complex US-India relationship influenced Delhi's Israel policy in the last months? Did this play a role in PM Modi's decision to visit Israel just before the war? If yes, what role? Yeah, and it's interesting because there is an Israel angle, there's a US angle, and there is a combination, right? Like they have a lot of overlap with each other.
Yeah, yeah. No, those are thank you, Ivan, that I saw recently in New Delhi. So thanks, Ivan. The intra-GCC rivalry is one of these other things that India greatly benefited from some degree of the relative stability within the GCCs for the past decade to have that outreach to all actors. There was another battle or tension between Qatar and the other GCC at one point. India, interestingly, did not take positions, was very much trying to be very calibrated. At the detriment, I think, a starting to be a good relationship between India and Qatar in 2015, 2016. But India still managed to keep some relation with Qatar, and these got facilitated by the Modi visit to Qatar. In the context of freeing up these prisoners, there was these Indian former militaries that were part of had been put in jails for supposedly being Israeli spies. Another interesting twist. Modi visited Doha and managed to get them freed, and also negotiated a big liquid gas LNG contract. So I think that also improved the relation with Qatar. So I think India has been careful not to get too much in position on this. I guess it took sides with the other GCCs, but still managed to keep some ties with Qatar. Right now, there's a question about the UAE Saudi spat, and I think in that situation, India and the UAE are the closest partner. I think India will still manage to keep good relations with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has important investments into India, so we will manage a relationship. But it's clearly that if at a strategic long-term level, India is closer aligned with the UAE. I mean, if you look at the diaspora, the imports, even so India and UAE have a free trade agreement. If you think that it's difficult to negotiate with India on a free trade agreement, then negotiate a SEPA, so the agreement it has with the UAE within 4 months, right? So less than 4 months. So that really that relationship is thriving, and Modi has been 7 times to UAE, very close relationship with MBZ. Again, there's also reciprocal visits. So I think there's closer alignment, and UAE has been able to get India to align with some of its positions. That being said, India will never take explicit sides. It will tilt a little bit, and that on that careful thread, it will tilt a little bit more, but it will still maintain a relationship with everybody. But it's that's another fault line that will create problems for India between the Israel-Iran, the Israeli GCC, the U.S. Tensions with Iran. The intra-Gulf states could also create problems for India, and will have them maybe manage the balancing game a little bit better than just trying to publicly be friends with everybody. At one point, you need maybe to take some positions on some of the important fault lines, even though you will try to always keep some degree of leeway to maintain a relationship. And India can. India is a major economy. It's one of the fastest growing G20 economies. It's in a major place to invest. So I guess all of these countries will want to maintain economic ties with India, and India can play on this to maybe take slightly some difficult positions on some intra GCC or intra West Asia, Middle East disputes. On the U.S.-India relationship, yes, actually historically, one of the biggest reasons India actually normalized ties with Israel in the early 90s was his desire to get closer to the U.S., notably on economic issues, right? India had a balance of crime. India had a balance of environment crisis. It needed U.S. support for investments. It needed U.S. support on different multilateral fora to get bailouts. So one of the things that was mentioned already in the early 80s when Narasimha Rao was talking to the U.S. For investments was that India needed to normalize its ties with Israel. There was a strong pressure from the Anti-Defamation League on the U.S. government because India had no diplomatic ties with Israel and wasn't, and so that was seen as a sort of discrimination. And the U.S. was always pressuring India to develop normal ties and better ties with Israel. So that was always part of the equation to some degree. And I have a strict analysis article on this that from IDSA that a few years ago. So it's about that equation about the India, US, Israel. So if you want to look in more details, there's also the early 2000s under the height of the neocon movement in the US. When India was trying to negotiate a nuclear deal at a time with the US, there's this axis of good argument that is mentioned by Brajesh Mishra when he goes to the American Jewish Committee in New Delhi, in DC, where he mentioned that there's this close alignment with India, US, and Israel in the context of the Iraq War and aftermath, right? So that was also part of there that facilitates all the rapprochement. One of the reasons India managed to get the Falcon early airborne warning system from Israel after the U.S. vetoed the sale from Israel to China is because of the strong relationship between U.S. and India, right? U.S. doesn't see India as a threat; it sees China as a threat, but facilitates the deal between Israel and India. So the U.S. has always been important for facilitating or pressuring India to have better relations with Israel. I think it's important, and that's I think an important point, Ivan. I think I looked a little bit out, but the fact that Modi went to Tel Aviv could also be linked to the difficulties that India-U.S. relations were in, right? Since August 2025, around the same time of the Doha and the Pakistan agreement, there's also the fact that India and U.S. had the tariff kind of escalation, right? And since then, India has been very careful about not being too critical of the U.S. in any diplomatic initiatives of the U.S. because it's trying to negotiate a trade deal, which was announced early February, a week after the India-EU free trade agreement. We don't know what that trade agreement actually looked like because then the Supreme Court decision has put everything up in the air. But I think that was also part of still the decision to try to signal to the U.S. that India can play a big role, that it's aligning somewhat with the U.S. interest to try to get some kind of leeway or space for negotiating a better trade deal terms. So maybe that rapprochement of Israel can also be in that light of the U.S. pressure put on India at the trade tariff level. But that definitely explains also why India has been not very critical of the U.S.-Israeli bombings in Iran, and that explains why the U.S. has not been too critical of the torpedoing of the frigate. This is a major event in India-U.S. relations for now close to a decade. The U.S. under different administration that's trying to push India to play a bigger role in net security provision in the Indian Ocean. And suddenly this happens without any consultation with India. You torpedo a ship that was invited by India for an exercise, by the way, a multilateral exercise the US participated in. So India, US had all operational information about that ship through the exercises, and torpedoes close to the Indian coast, right? So this is something that should be a major escalation in India-US ties. India stays completely silent, right? It is because it's pressured by these tariff negotiations at the same time. I think that can explain why India is in a tough position to be too critical or is trying to balance, so at least at the rhetorical level, its position vis-a-vis the conflict and its implications for the Middle East and South Asia.
Let me just jump in with one question before one final question that Nishant will ask. So, because you flagged in your talk about principles, and this is something that I just wanted to touch upon. Here, I mean, not the moral principle, which is a big debate that's going on in India, and morality is an important aspect of international relations. But I imagine that nobody's going to get persuaded one way or another. You are either believe that morality is important or not. So it's not really something that can be debated too much. But in terms of strategic principle, right, like the idea of multi-alignment, when you were talking about this idea of India's ability of managing Qatar and Gulf and this and that, and that has been the India's USP, foreign policy USP, that it has been able to manage that. And there's a phenomenal breakdown of that happening here. Is that something that is a cause for concern and rethink about the broader Indian foreign policy, and like somewhere it is lacking in New Delhi, do you think? Or is it something that, that this is a one-off and this is some special circumstances case? And I'll ask something related to that, which is not just that the decision that was made right now in the last 1 month, which is contingent on a lot of immediate factors. But what you pointed out as the larger decision in the last 6, 8 years to pull out of Iran under the maximum pressure campaign, right? India has tried to withstand American pressure in a lot of other fronts, right? Like Russia, I don't know what is the end decision that was made on Russian oil, but I mean, there was a whole standoff, and a lot of it was to do with India's right to be able to buy that. Even during Obama administration, India agreed to something, but there was a lot of push and pull and a lot of negotiation on it, and India did try to circumvent those negotiations at some point. So, I mean, the current decision aside, the larger decision in the last 8 years to pull out of Iran altogether on investment front, on this front, that front, right? Like just basically minimize all the exposure to Iran. What do you think about that? How does that square with the multi-alignment policy?
No, those are excellent points. On the principle, more the issue with the issue, and I think there's been a major break that was happening in a creeping fashion, discrete fashion, since 2014 and the election of Prime Minister Modi, and has become quite visible since October 7th. I already kind of hinted at that. The thing is, India had been able to develop really good relations with most actors in the Middle East since the early 90s, right? The fact that Modi has been able to develop really good relations with the UAE and goes to Abu Dhabi in 2015 is facilitated because there was this outreach already under Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh goes to Saudi Arabia. There was a couple of already important key visits. Now, Manmohan Singh didn't travel as much as Modi, so I think you have to look also at the different ministers in his government. And there was already a lot of security cooperation, trade agreements, trade discussions that were already going on before 2015. But the thing is, the different IEC governments and the previous BJP governments, by the way, Vajpayee government, were able to maintain kind of that multi-alignment, talking to everybody, while at the same time keeping a very principled position when it comes to the Palestine and on Iran to some degree too, right? So, and India had become, India developed a very good reputation because of that position, right? India can actually still build on this when there's all these countries now, for instance, recognizing finally the Palestinian state. India is like, well, we don't need to do that because we recognized in 1988. So, we've had this very historical principled position when it comes to the Palestinian state, the Palestinian Liberation Authority, the Palestine, the PLO. So we again have this very strong principle, long-term position and the Modi government always goes back to early statements, the 67 statements when it justifies some of its votes. But the problem since 2014, and the problem especially since October 7, is kind of this this kind of fluctuation in votes, which is often sometimes the government has justified as we look everything on a case by case basis, but there's a lot of incoherence to the point that some actors in the Middle East and some actors in the global South that I've talked to basically said, like, we used to understand India's position, right? He had a principled position on a couple of important issues in the Middle East since the 1950s. Uh, and then it's door to leverage. Everybody's pragmatic. Everybody's talking to Israel now. But then now we're just like, one statement we have Modi calling Prime Minister Netanyahu saying like we support you unconditionally on this attack that happened on October 7th. And then 2 weeks later, we have Shankar saying like the Palestinians were deprived of their homeland rights, right? So where is it? Where is it? It's India has become completely inaudible to the point that it complicates a little bit its relations with a lot of the actors in the global South and Middle East. It complicates itself when it wants to play a mediating role, right? We go back to this. So you need to kind of a principled position to have some kind of sustained systematic position to kind of play a mediating role. You can't just be, as Jaishankar mentioned it once when he was at Carnegie in DC, what role could India eventually play in the escalation of tensions in the Middle East? And say, well, we're friends with everybody, which is true. India is friends with everybody and couldn't play that. But then he follows up by saying we can share messages, right? So is that the role of India? Does it want to just share messages, or does it want to be Oman, right? Or should it broker like China did with Saudi Arabia and Iran, or play, even a greater role that Oman actually did is to actually, if it's friends with everybody, can it host a conference just like Pakistan is trying to do to try to de-escalate tensions? But for that, I think you need to have some degree of position which everybody can understand and not just be swinging one side or the other, depending on the crisis or depending on the tariff pressures you have from the US or whatever. So I think India has lost that. That will be difficult to correct. So I think that there's been a long-term shift that I think India still could go back. It's inaudible, and that creates problems about predictions of where India will stand when there's another escalation. And on Iran, I think there's been this longer trend on oil, which is linked to maximum pressure, which is linked to India trying to get closer to US on various matters, which is, I think, less linked to the tilt towards Israel. I think it's mostly about the US, but also more decisively, the tilt toward the Gulf states. I think India has been tilting much more towards the UAE, and if you want to watch a tilt that happened over the last decade, and it's an article that's going to come out in the India's World, the magazine from the CSDR, about I think the real tilt is towards the UAE and the Gulf states, right? So that's where India will calibrate and align its positioning. It's to preserve its relationship with the GCCs. And the fact that it's got more oil, more energy from the GCCs over the last decade explains why it's less dependent on Iran. It's also benefit also from getting cheap oil from Russia. So that explains also for the last 2-3 years where its energy relationship with Iran is really very has limited significance these days. So I think that, and the thing that also the reason India is so decoupled or sort of imported less from Iran is because it could get the waiver from Trump 1.0 from the Biden administration on Chabahar. And I think that was really important for India. I think the North-South corridor is still very much in the mind of Indian decision makers, very important to preserve some kind of connectivity, access, and alternatives. Now there's IMEC. IMEC is a big talk right now, but the logistical feasibility of IMEC is being debated, whether if there's a crisis or not, because even logistically it's very difficult to achieve IMEC, and now the crisis suspends everything. And then, North-South corridor could be another alternative, which is still, but that actually is more about potential. So I think Chabahar was very much important for the Modi government until recently, and under this accumulated pressure from the US, where it had really to basically reduce or even cut most of its ties with Iran. So I think it's been a long-term process explained by different structural developments. And the last 5-6 months, I think, is what we discussed with the previous question, is the tariff discussion with the US, which has pushed India to cede on Chabahar, to cede more on energy, and to basically be silent on the mounting up pressure on Iran of the last month or two. Yeah.
Okay. Last question, because we are a little going now. We are going over time, but
Sorry,
I'll plug in this last question
long
with
answers.
Nishant Raji.
Yeah. And Nishant.
My question is the potential role of the BRICS. How do you see India
Yeah.
playing a balancing role within BRICS, where several members are not aligned with the US agenda? How does India square its commitment to the BRICS with its relations with Israel and US?
This is a fascinating question because India has already been the odd man out in the BRICS since October 7, 2023. Basically, it's been diluting or vetoing to some degree some of the more critical resolution or statements coming out from the BRICS, notably when South Africa was the hosting the BRICS. And so it's put India in a very difficult position, especially with the expansion. It will put India in a very difficult position now with the expansion. You have Iran, you have Saudi Arabia, UAE now part of the BRICS, right? So it's creating a lot of these problems for India, and India is now the host of the BRICS, right? So there's going to be discussions about the next BRICS Foreign Minister Summit and eventually a Leaders Summit, and it suspends the actual possibility of having these meetings at least on site and actually coming to a joint resolution, because every BRICS summit had always a statement about the Israel-Palestine issue in a joint resolution, right? At the end of the Leaders Summit. Now, the question is, will it happen this time? And will this create tensions as we had in the previous BRICS summit? Will India actually join the BRICS summit? Where's BJ Shankar going? Because there's the India-China spat. This could actually create another tensions about who will be there. How will India be able to conciliate different positions? Will other joint statements be actually affected by the lack of agreement on the Israel-Iran issue? This is going to create a problem. And it's actually one of the other problems. It's putting India on the spot and hates that. Its multi-alignment policy has always been because it actually doesn't need to take statement, doesn't need to have a statement, doesn't need to take a stand. And the summit is hill time for them to actually, because they will have to have a public statement and they will have to play a conciliating mediating role. It's happening behind the doors right now. No clear idea where this is going to go, but it's really pushing India in a difficult position. What will come out of it is not clear. Yeah, I mean, there will be. I mean, India has some experience. It had the G20 where Lavrov and Blinken showed up. Obviously, when Biden went to Delhi, Putin didn't go. But so it has some experience of trying to conciliate very difficult positions. But I think this is actually putting India more on the spot than the G20 diplomatic balancing of the 2023, because it could work around with the Europeans to try to find some kind of middle solution. Right now, it's actually in the minority in the BRICS, and we'll have to play with that very difficult game in the coming weeks.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic conversation. We learned a lot about a very timely issue. It was really great to have you, but I really hope that we don't have to have you again in like a couple of months because the war is still not over.
Yeah.
Let's hope that
Yeah.
you relax now because the war is over and the Middle East has quieted down. Let's hope for that. But in the
Let's hope for
meantime,
that. Yeah. More
yeah.
for the country, the region's sake than mine. But yeah, so
Yeah,
we
now
hopefully some
because
de-escalation.
now it is
Yeah.
beginning to affect everybody, including Singapore, which is usually insulated from a lot of these factors. But
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
today, Grab here, which is the ride-hailing app, they have added a fuel surcharge now, so it's coming
Okay.
even for Singapore.
It's
Um,
affecting everyone. Yeah.
yeah. So, but thank you very much. Thank you everyone for
Yeah.
joining us. We will meet next month again to discuss. We'll be talking with Arzan Tarapur and we'll be discussing what US wants from India in Indo-Pacific. So, thank you everyone. See you again, and thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone. Thank you for the great questions.